This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether it's your new profession or just a lifelong passion, start your journey to website glory with Squarespace. Check out their amazing all-in-one platform through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. Go looking through US presidents from the first half of the 20th century and you'll find a surplus of icons. Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and Harry Truman are still famous for being among America's greatest leaders, while Warren G. Harding and Herbert Hoover are famous for being the exact opposite. Heck, even William McKinley and William Howard Taft remain known, one for being assassinated, the other for being so fat he was practically a walking your mum joke. Yet, the most fascinating president of this era is also likely the one most of us have never heard of. Calvin Coolidge rarely makes lists of best or worst commanders-in-chief. Outside political history geek circles, his 5 years and 7 months in office are barely remembered, yet they constituted one of the most quietly radical eras that Washington has ever seen. As president of the 1920s, Coolidge oversaw a roaring economy, even as he trimmed government spending to the bone. When he left office, it was as a conservative hero, a man who'd brought prosperity. So why isn't Silent Cal better remembered today? The answer lies in a tale of excess, prosperity, and heartbreak. In terms of over-the-top symbolism, it's hard to beat a future president of the United States being born on Independence Day. But that's exactly what John Calvin Coolidge did, entering the world on July 4th, 1872 like a living metaphor. Yet this well-timed entrance would turn out to be a rare flash of bombast in the quiet life of the 30th president. And we don't mean quiet in the sense of boring, we mean he literally barely ever spoke. Growing up in picturesque but hardscrabble Plymouth, Vermont, young Calvin absorbed the family trait of speaking only when absolutely necessary. Even the boy's father, who was a merchant and a legislator, and thus expected to occasionally talk to people, treated words like expensive chocolates, dosing them out in small doses and only on special occasions. Compared to his son, though, the man was practically loquacious. Calvin Coolidge grew up so silent it was a local joke that he was mute. For the boy, muttering a greeting was a conversation, while exchanging two sentences was like launching into a soliloquy. While that quietness was in his nature, though, the boy also relished the opportunity that it gave him to observe. As most kids his age were playing or studying, Coolidge seemed to be absorbing life lessons, storing them away in a special safe deep within his soul. He noted, for example, the way debt crushed family friends, a fate he swore he'd never endure. He noticed, too, the way his father's economical use of speech wasn't a hindrance at town meetings, but almost a superpower, a way to ensure no one could ever throw ill-advised words back in his face. Much later, Coolidge would remark of his own taciturn nature, "The things I don't say never get me into trouble." Yet, there were also times when perhaps more should have been said. When Coolidge turned 12, his mother died of tuberculosis. Sent in to see her one last time, he was merely told by his father not to cry. In the aftermath of her death, there was mourning, but no grieving. The two men simply never spoke about it, much as they would keep silent when Coolidge's sister died. It's back to these twin tragedies that some today trace Coolidge's temperament: irritable, melancholic, and difficult to be around. But you could also just as easily trace back to them his drive to succeed. Years earlier, Coolidge's grandfather had left the boy 40 acres on the understanding that he continued to work the hard Vermont soil like his family always had. Instead, following his sister's death, the boy suddenly left Plymouth, traveled to Amherst to get an education. There, Coolidge was unwanted by the fraternities, forced to live instead in boarding houses. This turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as it allowed him to gradually level up his social skills. He didn't really do small talk, but at least every sentence no longer felt like a double colonoscopy. Where he did start to excel, though, was in making speeches. It sounds counterintuitive. I mean, a guy for whom hello was one word too many was happy to get up before an auditorium and wow them for 40 minutes. Yet it seems Coolidge's natural reticence simply melted away in these formal settings. In the sheltered world of college, he was free to discover his hidden talents. He was also free to discover his political beliefs. One of Coolidge's tutors at Amherst was Professor Charles Garman, a guy who regularly turned his lectures into paeans on individual liberty, property rights, and conservatism. Under his spell, Coolidge began to identify more and more as a Republican. By the time he graduated, it was no longer enough to return to Plymouth and get into farming. No, the young man now had another destiny, one it might be even harder to reap rewards from than the cold northeastern soil. Coolidge was going to get into politics. Normally when we do videos on presidents who came up through party politics like Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, there's a section where their career takes off like a rocket ship. Calvin Coolidge's rise, by contrast, was like watching a snail climb up a stepladder. Rather than aim straight for the House or Senate, Coolidge instead set his sights on the city council in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he moved after graduation. Only 5 years later did he bolster this with a run for the school committee, a race that he lost. But rather than shrug his shoulders and move on, Silent Cal went back. He analysed what had gone wrong. He tried to figure out how he could have turned the loss into a win. When he next stood for election, he'd use that knowledge to secure his victory. For the rest of his career, Coolidge never lost a single race. And so Silent Cal began his slow but unstoppable rise through the Massachusetts GOP. He became a member of the State House of Representatives, then mayor of Northampton, then a state senator, and then a lieutenant governor. As he rose, he began to develop his politicals. In 1912, Coolidge mediated a textile strike in Lawrence and came away convinced a pro-business anti-strike position was the only one to take. That same year, he threw his lot in with William Howard Taft's re-election bid, divorcing himself from the Republican progressive wing personified by Teddy Roosevelt. More important, though, may have been Coolidge's time in the state Senate. There, he realized the work of government shouldn't be passing endless laws, but actively revoking bad ones. That the state passed fewer bills while he was Senate president was long a source of pride for him. Still, we don't want to give the impression that Coolidge's life was nothing but politics. There was also time for romance. For a man as dour as Coolidge loved to be, the story of how he met Grace Goodhue is unexpectedly sweet. A teacher at Northampton School for the Deaf, Silent Cal one day heard her laughing through an open window and was so enamored by the sound that he resolved then and there to date her. They married in 1905, leading to the snarky joke that Grace taught the deaf to hear, now she might be able to teach the mute to speak. By the time the Wilson presidency got underway, Coolidge was a happily married father of two with a solid career as a conservative lawmaker who was independent enough to track left on stuff like women's rights and immigration. In the 1918 race for Massachusetts governor, this combination was enough to land him the job. He was sworn in the following January, just in time for the crisis that would make his name. The Boston police strike was a mass walkout over the right to form a union. Suddenly, without cops, the city plunged into chaos and looting. But rather than do as everyone expected and cut a deal, Coolidge went on the attack. Ordering the state guard into Boston to restore order, Coolidge fired all the striking officers, declaring, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." It was such a forceful reaction that his friends begged him not to sign the order, saying it would end his career. Instead, it turned Coolidge into a national hero. The lawlessness in Boston had horrified the nation. People saw the police officers not as regular strikers, but as deserters who'd surrendered the city. So when Coolidge crushed the strike, America applauded. Even Woodrow Wilson came out in support of him. From a solid but unremarkable governor, Calvin Coolidge had suddenly become the hottest property in politics, just as the election year of 1920 dawned. Not that his party was currently looking for anyone popular or principled to lead it. The 1920 Republican convention saw the affably corrupt, infinitely clubbable Warren G. Harding handed the nomination in a shady backroom deal. Angered by these shenanigans, the rank-and-file delegates rebelled, forcing one of their own picks onto the party ticket as VP. Coolidge was in the governor's mansion in Boston when he got the call that a voter insurgency had landed him the vice presidential nomination. His wife, Grace, asked if he was going to accept. "I suppose I shall have to," he replied with characteristic understatement. And just like that, Coolidge's path to the presidency was set. Now, if you want your path to a great website to be set, you've got to visit our longtime sponsor, Squarespace. This is the age of creation. People are making new things on the internet all the time. You probably know someone, or maybe you yourself want to start something online. And when it's time to move that project from your head onto the screen in front of you and get it out to the world, that's where Squarespace comes in. It's the perfect web tool to help you turn the internet into whatever you want it to be. Maybe the hands-on type with lots of opinions and ideas about what exactly your website should look like. If so, very cool. Squarespace gives you all the customization options you could ever want with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. Or maybe you just need something functional, something that works with minimal thought so you can stay focused on the content and not just the coat of paint. Well, just use one of their quick, beautiful templates to make a website that's both fresh and simple. And once you're done setting up your website, locking in the name, playing with the colors if you want, well, there are so many extra features that Squarespace provides so that your website can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support, everything you could ever want in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, it's got to be with Squarespace. Right now, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your site, go to squarespace.com/ Biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And let's get back to Quiet Cal. Come the 1920 election, the question wasn't if the Republicans would win, but just how much of a blowout victory was on the cards. After 8 years of Wilson's progressive agenda, after a war that had killed 116,000 Americans, after a deadly pandemic, and amid a deep recession, people were simply ready for change. Warren Harding capitalized on this, running with Coolidge under the slogan, "A return to normalcy," without ever telling anyone what exactly that meant. Not that this ambiguity mattered. That November, Harding and Coolidge demolished their Democratic opponents, James M. Cox and his VP pick, Franklin D. Roosevelt, thus making Coolidge the only person to ever defeat FDR in a national election. It was a landslide win, a sign the electorate was ready for real Republican leadership. Unfortunately, what they got was Harding and his dodgy mates sucking the nation dry. As you might remember from our video on him, Warren Harding and his Ohio gang were of the go big or go home school of corruption. In his 3 years on the job, they did everything from sell off the Navy's oil reserves to their friends to steal life-saving medicine from veterans' hospitals. Luckily for Coolidge, though, they never once cut their VP in on the action. As far as the White House was concerned, Silent Cal was a boring sap they'd got lumbered with, the lame Milhouse to Harding's devilish Bart. So they basically ghosted him. Coolidge had little contact with Harding's team. Even in Congress, Coolidge's role as Senate President was sidelined by GOP Majority Leader and Harding pal Henry Cabot Lodge. It was a time of immense frustration for Coolidge, but it would also save his career. By 1923, corruption under Harding had gotten so extreme, ranging from extortion to unleashing the DOJ on political enemies, that the Senate had started taking note. Before the scandals could break, though, Harding went and died of a suspected stroke. On hearing the news, it said that Henry Cabot Lodge turned pale and cried in disbelief, "My God, that means Coolidge is president." As indeed he was. The day Harding went off to the great pig trough in the sky, Coolidge was vacationing with his family back in Plymouth, far away from any telephone line. By the time a messenger reached the house, the vice president was asleep. He was woken in the night by his father, now a justice of the peace, and told to get ready. Coolidge got out of bed, prayed, and went downstairs. In the early hours of August 3rd, 1923, Silent Cal stood under a kerosene lamp in a darkened room in his childhood home while his father administered the oath of office. At 2:24 a.m., Coolidge officially became the 30th President of the United States. The drama over, he went straight back to bed as if nothing had changed. But of course, it had. Dimly aware of the brewing scandals, Coolidge became president just as revelations of Harding's misconduct exploded. Just as during the police strike, the new president responded ruthlessly. Harding's crimes were open to investigation, while his old Ohio gang were purged from government. Although Coolidge trod carefully at first, afraid of uncovering too much corruption in his party ahead of the 1924 election, all of the 29th president's lackeys had soon been cold-bloodedly dispatched from Washington. Amid the booming economy of the 1920s, this show of force was enough for voters. Rather than punish Coolidge for his proximity to Harding, they instead rewarded him. In November 1924, Coolidge carried over 54% of the vote, securing himself a full term. The era of clearing up Harding's mess was over. From now on, Coolidge would be his own president. And while his term would never be as dramatic as Harding's, it would still manage to radically reshape everything Washington thought it knew about government. The arrival of a monosyllabic president was a field day for American satirists. H.R. Mencken famously declared that President Coolidge's ideal day was, quote, would be one in which nothing happens. But while this was meant in jest, it does get to an essential truth. Not that Silent Cal wanted nothing to ever happen, but that he wanted the federal government to do as little as possible. Conservative to his core, Coolidge believed that businesses should be left to themselves, that the states should take care of their own affairs, and that Washington should aim for blissful inaction. Combine this with his penchant for taking long afternoon naps, and the 30th president got a reputation as a man with all the spirit of a recently deceased dodo. Yet Coolidge wasn't lazy. He really believed America could basically run itself, once saying, if the federal government were to go out of business, the common run of people would not detect the difference. The only time he got really animated was where money was concerned. Throughout his tenure, Coolidge obsessively cut government spending, even dictating what color bags the Postal Service used in order to save a few pennies. He became one of the few modern presidents to run a budget surplus surplus, something he called among the noblest monuments of virtue. But it wasn't just spending Coolidge slashed. Taxes also got the knife, with the top rate plummeting to 25%, still the lowest on record since World War I. Among the not rich majority of the population, federal taxes dropped to effectively nothing. And all this cutting and light-touch regulation really seemed to work. The Coolidge prosperity is basically what we think of when we think of the Roaring Twenties. Growth was strong, wages soared, unemployment fell, and money was everywhere. It sounds great, and for most people living through it, it probably was. Yet we'd be lying if we said there wasn't a dark side to the Coolidge prosperity. The 30th president was so committed to small government, for example, that it sometimes eclipsed his humanity. In 1927, catastrophic flooding along the Mississippi River inundated an area the size of the Republic of Ireland. 200,000 people were displaced and whole communities were ruined. Yet Coolidge was adamant the affected towns should pay for the damage themselves. It took the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, to convince him to begrudgingly launch a federal relief effort. Similarly, a federal anti-lynching bill that had been championed by Harding was quietly dropped by Silent Cal, who felt the groundbreaking legislation would have infringed on states' rights. But the darkest side of all involved the thing Coolidge loved the most: business. As the second half of the 20s roared into view, Wall Street was doing a worse and worse job of regulating itself. Speculation was out of control. Elsewhere, the agricultural sector was in dire need of help. Yet Coolidge never intervened, and well, we all know where that ended. Still, hindsight is 20/20. It's worth noting that no one in Coolidge's time saw the Wall Street crash coming. No, they were too busy enjoying their Great Gatsby-style parties and moving jerkily to the distant strains of jazz. Broadly then, life was good in the Coolidge years, so good that everyone expected him to run for a second term in 1928 and to win. But there was one person who wasn't enjoying the Coolidge prosperity, despite being at the very heart of it. As his term wore on, the 30th president began to spend more and more time sleeping, long, epic slumbers that soon left him with as little as a 4-hour workday. In his era, Coolidge's hypersomnia was a not-so-secret joke, a strange quirk of a strange president. But in the last couple of decades, a new theory has emerged, one that could explain a lot about his one term. What if Calvin Coolidge wasn't just some quiet dude who liked naps, but someone in the grips of a depression so deep he could no longer see a way out? In summer 1924, less than a year after his dad's unexpected elevation to the presidency, 16-year-old Calvin Coolidge Jr. stepped onto a White House tennis court for an impromptu game. It was a regular day, nothing special. If you'd watched Calvin Jr. and his older brother play their set, you wouldn't have thought anything about it. But after a few games, it was clear that something wasn't right. In his rush to get on court, Calvin Jr. hadn't bothered to put on socks. Now a blister had formed on his foot, causing him to call off the game. That boring, unremarkable afternoon, nobody thought much of it. It was just an interrupted tennis match. There would be plenty more in the future. It was only when disaster struck that people would think back to that game, to that afternoon, and see the roots of the tragedy that would soon consume the White House. Within days, the blister on Calvin Jr.'s foot had become infected. In these years before penicillin, there was nothing the family could do, nothing but watch helplessly as the infection became blood poisoning. Calvin Coolidge Jr. died on July 7, 1924, a little over 11 months into his father's first partial term. As his son slipped away, Silent Cal sat at his bedside, a locket clutched in one hand. In that locket was a picture of his own mother, who died all those years ago, and a lock of her hair. He pressed it into his boy's palm until the boy could hold it no more. As Calvin Jr. died, the locket fell from his fingers. The death of the family's golden boy hit the Coolidges hard. Both the 30th president and his wife Grace were plunged into a deep depression. As Coolidge later said of the day his son died, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. Among presidents, only a handful have lost their children while serving in office, most famously Abraham Lincoln. But there's good reason to believe Coolidge suffered more than any of them. Having never properly grieved his mother or his sister, the death of Calvin Jr. seems to have simply broken him. It was in the aftermath that Coolidge began sleeping as much as possible, drifting away from life, from the pain of his memories, for up to 16 hours at a time. He showed nearly all the signs of major depression, from an inability to take joy in things to viciously blaming himself for everything that had gone wrong. Some days he seems to have done little more than to put his head on his desk, close his eyes and weep. Now, we don't want to overdo this. During his full term, Coolidge was hardly bedridden with grief. He worked to cut taxes, liaised with his cabinet, held regular press conferences. He was even capable of dry wit, such as when he responded to a woman who said she'd made a bet that she could make him say more than 3 words at dinner with "you lose." In short, he was functioning, but functioning isn't the same as actually living. Somewhere deep beneath that cold, mysterious exterior, A tiny spark seemed to have gone out. In its place came nothing but a weariness so vast that it eclipsed everything. The loss of Calvin Jr. affected Grace just as badly. In 1927, she appears to have had an affair, possibly with someone connected to the White House. There's evidence that Coolidge found out. And so we come to the final act of Coolidge's presidency. In the summer of 1927, Silent Cal passed a note to reporters who'd come to document his family vacation. It simply read, "I do not choose to run for president," in 1928. At the time, the announcement caused shockwaves. To this very day, what caused Coolidge to pull out is still hotly debated. But whatever the rational reason, it seems doubtful that the image of Calvin Jr. slipping away wasn't somewhere in the back of his mind, haunting him as it would for the rest of his life. At the time Coolidge handed the baton over to his former Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, he had every reason to think history would smile kindly on him. He'd overseen a prolonged economic boom that lifted Americans out of poverty. He'd pushed the International Kellogg-Briand Pact, committing nations to avoiding war. He'd forged a new, less aggressive policy towards Latin America. He'd kept the US out of the League of Nations. He achieved a balanced budget. In fact, Coolidge in 1928 was so popular that Republicans tried to get his name on the party ticket. Refusal to run be damned. Silent Cal had to practically beg them to instead nominate Hoover. Not that the GOP needed to have worried. Hoover was elected in a landslide, in a large part by playing off of Coolidge's legacy. So yeah, it seems fair to say that as Coolidge left Washington in March of 1929, that he felt sure of being remembered. But of course, that's not what happened. That October, the collapse of the financial system and subsequent Great Depression killed the 30th president's reputation. People charged that he'd seen the collapse coming when he decided not to run for re-election, that his policies had single-handedly created the economic catastrophe. With nearly a century of hindsight, we can see these charges weren't true. There were so many intertwining causes of the Depression that it's doubtful anyone could have averted it. Still, Coolidge could have done more, and the public seemed to recognize this. Just like Harding years earlier, Coolidge's post-presidency reputation was soon utterly trashed. Tragically, he wouldn't live long enough to see his rehabilitation. Calvin Coolidge died of a heart attack on January 5, 1933, as America stood on the cusp between two eras. Behind lay the wreckage of the Roaring Twenties and the prosperity Coolidge had been so proud of. Ahead lay the uncharted waters of the New Deal of FDR, an era that had no place for men like Silent Cal. Today, Calvin Coolidge is arguably the least remembered 20th century president. Washington has no significant memorial to him. There is no presidential library. Even the Coolidge Auditorium in the Library of Congress is named for a patron who just happened to share his last name. In scholarly rankings too, Coolidge remains obscure, often appearing right in the middle of the pack. He's surrounded by other non-entities like Grover Cleveland and James A. Garfield. And yet, despite his near invisibility, Silent Cal has still managed to have an outsized influence on the modern world. 51 years after Coolidge left the White House, another president came in with similar thoughts on government. Known as Ronald Reagan, one of his first acts was to hang a portrait of Coolidge in the cabinet office to help inspire his own conservative program. It's a sweet irony of history, isn't it? Perhaps the most obscure 20th century president inspiring one of the most iconic. But then, that's Calvin Coolidge, a man who could sometimes be small, sometimes great, sometimes playful, sometimes depressed. But what he and his presidency never were was anything less than fascinating. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.